A few years ago, I said that J.J. Abrams would never get his hands on The Lord of the Rings. Well, I was wrong. Very, very wrong. Amazon finally released details about their new series, The Rings of Power. They put out a teaser trailer a few weeks ago that was met with a lot of meh because it looked faked even though it was real. The behind-the-scenes footage showing how the whole thing was done looked better than the finished teaser. That pretty much sums up what was revealed in this Vanity Fair article. The behind-the-scenes content will probably look awesome, but the finished product is going to leave much to be desired. And that's because this production seems to be The Lord of the Rings in name only. It's not an easy thing to try to follow Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films. It's so hard that even Peter Jackson couldn't match Peter Jackson. And he's Peter Jackson. The Hobbit films pale in comparison to the Lord of the Rings films, and every fantasy show or film that's come out since those movies has had to meet that standard, and it's the very highest. Those films got more people into j.r.r. Tolkien's work than anything else. They ironically created more hardcore fans who want to see Tolkien's work brought to life as written, despite that the films deviated from the books. That's the power of those films and the power of Tolkien's word. People want to see what he wrote brought to life. And honestly, films aren't the best way to do that because they're too short. There's so much happening in Tolkien's stories that you need dozens of hours to tell them fully. As Game of Thrones proved, a TV series would be the better format. However, Game of Thrones also showed what happens when showrunners decide that they know better than the author of the book and then go off on their own tangent. The moment those dudes decided to rush the plot and create their own story based on j.r.r. Martin's notes instead of his finished books, they killed the show. It went from intrigue, ambiguity, and no character, not even the leads, being safe, to the typical fantasy yarn with random twists thrown in because they wanted to subvert expectations. Season 8 was an embarrassment so bad that even the actors didn't want to talk about it. The backlash was so bad that it killed interest in the future Game of Thrones series dead. And The Rings of Power looks like it's going to be dead on arrival. From the Vanity Fair article, quote, Galadriel's world is a raging sea, far from the wise, ethereal elven queen that Cate Blanchett brought to Peter Jackson's acclaimed films. The Galadriel played by Morpheus Clark in Amazon's upcoming series is thousands of years younger, as angry and brash as she is clever, and certain that evil is looming closer than anyone realizes. Okay, so that's not from the books. I've read The Silmarillion every year since 2003. I don't recall Galadriel being described as angry or brash. Proud? Yes. Clever? Yes. But never angry, never brash. But that does sound familiar. Where have I heard this before? Oh, that's right. It's the generic personality given to every action girl. I bet you're gonna deck her out in armor with a half-shaved head and braids. Oh my God. You know, when people said this was going to happen, you know it was a joke, right? We didn't actually want you to do it. We were joking. So they're changing Galadriel's character, making her a commander of the Northern Army. What army? She was never part of any army in the Second Age. For the first third of the Second Age, she'd pass over the Blue Mountains with Celeborn into what would eventually become the Shire, and went further east, wandering around there for 1,200 years before she comes back into what's left of Lindon after Balerion sank into the sea. There's this line about her hunting down, quote, the last remnants of her collaborators, presumably Morgoth and Sauron, who claimed the life of her brother. Which brother? Finrod, Angrod, or Ignor? If it's the last two, they died in 455 of the First Age. Finrod died 10 years later, but he was reincarnated shortly after, and still lives in Eldamar. Either way, Galadriel doesn't show up into what's left of Lindon until 1200 in the Second Age, literally 1,335 years later. This bitch has been holding a grudge for 1,300 years? Baby, listen, if it's taking you that long, just let it go. The only way this works is if you compress time, which the showrunners admit they're going to do, but if you do that, you completely jack up the lore. The amount of time that passes is part of the narrative. You could get away with this in The Lord of the Rings because Frodo's 17-year time jump would nuke any urgency and danger being built. If the One Ring is the most dangerous thing ever, you can't go 17 years later and then have Frodo sit for another several months pussyfooting around when he knows Sauron knows where the ring is. That doesn't work on film. With the creation of the Rings of Power, the whole point is that Sauron took his time. He tricks the elves, teaching them how to make lesser rings before crafting the 16. Celebrimbor then takes what he learned and fashions a 3, and then Sauron makes the 1. All this happens over the course of 400 years. Then for another 1800 years, the elves fight Sauron as he buddies up with the Númenóreans, tricking the kings into following him. Since this is supposed to be spread out over 5 seasons, you have plenty of time to do time jumps. Yes, that means you'll lose some of your main characters, but if the point is to tell the untold story of the Second Age, there's no reason not to do that. Instead of trying to cover the whole Second Age, it would make more sense to just pick a key moment and tell a story set around that, say the forging of the Elven Rings. Virtually all the people in that cast would be elves, so you could time jump with no problem. Or you could start with Isildur's story, leading up to the Battle of Dagorlad. That way you would have some of the elves in the story, and show the founding of Gondor, which would tie into the Lord of the Rings films. Of course, the showrunners are acting like this is a problem, as if there wasn't some kind of storytelling technique, say, something that would allow you to flash back to things that happened in the past, that would allow you to tell the stories that you're not showing in present time. I think Vanity Fair got it right when they said, if the show works, it can become a global phenomenon. If it falls short, it can become a cautionary tale for anyone who, to quote j.r.r. Tolkien, delves too greedily and too deep. Too greedily? Yes. Too deep? No. Because they're not interested in the lore. They're more interested in telling their own stories that have nothing to do with anything Tolkien wrote. Which begs the question of why are you using his stories? The normies won't know what you're doing, but the Tolkien fans will. The moment you deviate, we'll know just like Gil-galad, Círdan, and Galadriel knew when Sauron created the One Ring. We will cast your show aside, lest we be corrupted. If you want to tell your own stories, just do that. Make your own version of the Lord of the Rings. You wouldn't be the first or the worst to do it. Bookstores are filled with knockoffs. Make your own and call it a day instead of taking someone else's work and twisting it to suit you. Another reason this happened is because the Tolkien estate sold Amazon the rights of several of Tolkien's works for $1 billion, but with the condition that the principal lore is not changed and that they have some creative control. That means nothing Tolkien wrote or specified is supposed to be altered. Anything he didn't mention or didn't clarify can be played with or invented. In theory, that's the rule. In practice, it looks like the showrunners Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne kind of ignored that, which explains why Galadriel is nothing like Galadriel and why Elrond, yes, that's supposed to be Elrond, why he's described as an architect and politician, not the healer and lore master aligned with Gil-galad like he actually was. Then we have this. This is supposed to be a Sylvan elf who are part of the Nondor, who are described as having dark hair and white or olive skin. Think Mediterranean. Yes, there are some people of that area who are dark-skinned, however the mentioning of white skin implies Tolkien is talking about the lighter olive skin, not this. Even then, Amazon couldn't get the aesthetic right because he doesn't even have long hair, which all the elves did, and neither does Elrond, who's now blonde, even though most of the Noldor have dark hair. Oh, but that's not the part. The part is this deal about the not-Sylvan elf named Arondir, who's also in a forbidden romance with a human named Bronwyn. Right. So, because the Tolkien estate blocked you from using Beren and Luthien, Tuor and Idril, and Arundel and Elwig, you didn't just made up a new elf and human romance. What happened the last time someone made up a forbidden romance that wasn't in the real story? Oh, that's right. It sucked. Tauriel and Killy's romance added nothing to the plot, story, or themes, and proved Tauriel was a cool but pointless character who didn't need to be in the film. It's arrogant to come in and just change someone's story because you'd rather tell something else. And the showrunners have that arrogance in spades. Quote, the driving question behind the production, McKay adds, was this. Can we come up with the novel Tolkien never wrote and do it as a mega event series that could only happen now? No and no. How do I know? 1, because Tolkien did write it, it's called the Silmarillion. 2, Princess Doritos. That's a dwarf. Oh yeah, that's a dwarf. Specifically a dwarf princess from Moria. Tolkien based the dwarves on Norse folklore. He even got the names of the ones mentioned in The Hobbit from the Poetic Edda, a Norse epic poem, which also mentions Gandalf and even Oakenshield. Tolkien never describes the dwarves as looking anything remotely close to African, nor does it make sense that they would look that way since they all live underground, meaning out of the sunlight. They would never get this dark. But fine, you want to have the totally racially inaccurate black dwarf? Go ahead. But I was informed by another dwarf that,
in fact, They are so alike in voice and appearance that they're often mistaken for dwarf men. It's the beards.
So where's her beard? Did she eat it up with the rest of the Doritos? Oh, don't act like nobody noticed all the gold on her fingers. She's either eating her jewelry or finger banging Smaug. Y'all so obsessed with representation that you missed the perfect chance to have a bearded woman. You could have hired a transgender actor like Matt Walsh, put him in blackface, I'm sure it wouldn't be his first time, and have at it. Dwarf women have beards. They look so much alike the men that other races think there are no dwarf women. This is basic to the lore, so to leave that out tells us everything we need to know about the showrunners' respect for Tolkien's work. They seem to show so little respect for it that they got rid of people who did. The article mentions Tom Shippey getting canned by Amazon shortly after he gave an unapproved interview stating what the showrunners couldn't do. Shippey has talked about Tolkien's work for longer than I've been alive, so to boot him, even for breaking an NDA but not revealing anything about the production, says quite a bit about what's going on with the series. Vanity Fair mentions that Amazon was tight-lipped until now, and they won't share the names of other Tolkien scholars they're talking to. Based on what's happened and what's been revealed, that makes me suspicious. I think they're going for the revisionist scholars instead of the purists like Shippey, trying to find people who will validate their changes. I also think this is why they hid the details about the show for so long. They knew it wouldn't go over well with fans, but they're so committed to their revisions that they thought they could just dump it in chunks and people would like it. Nope. They got destroyed on social media and in the press over their changes, especially about the beardless dwarf and the lackluster look of the show. They spent $462 million on this season alone, and it still barely looks better than MTV's Shannara. From what we've seen, the show doesn't look like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. It doesn't look like it fits in that world. Looks more like Game of Thrones or OK Cosplay. Part of this might be the presentation in Vanity Fair. The show might look different when it's gone through some cinematic color grading. But honestly, the designs themselves look half-baked. They look like fantasy, instead of the mostly real looks in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In the Jackson films, all the designs were created to make each culture stand out at a glance. If you didn't tell me this woman was supposed to be a dwarf, I'd never know. Nothing about her design tells me that. The same goes for this not elf. Nothing about this design reads as anything like the elves in the Jackson films. And keep in mind, the showrunners are treating this show as if it connects to those films. To lose those elements, especially with the dwarves and elves, is criminal. It's just maddening, but not as much as the anyone who doesn't like the changes is racist routine. Tolkien scholar Mariana Rios Maldonado says, quote, "Who are these people who feel so threatened or disgusted by the idea that an elf is black or Latino or Asian? Why are you strawmanning like Ron DeSantis? I'm not even going to entertain your stupid question because it's not the issue. The issue is that Tolkien's work is based on English, Norse, and Celtic folklore. He wrote the stories to replace the English folklore lost due to all the invasions and French influences. He said and wrote this several times over decades. Middle-earth is basically northwestern Europe, mostly England. The native people of those areas are all white, so all the races of Middle-earth would be white. And we know that's true because Tolkien described what they looked like. They're all white. The actors can be non-white, and if they can pass as European, with or without makeup, they can play those characters. They just need to look the part. Casting non-white actors in a Middle-earth show is like casting white actors in a Black Panther movie. It makes no sense. It's like the showrunners adding the Harfoots, hobbits, because people like hobbits, even though the hobbits have nothing to do with anything in the Second Age. And the showrunners admit this, quote, "McKay and Payne have constructed a pastoral Harfoot society that thrives on secrecy and evading detection, so they can play out a kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead story in the margins of the bigger quest. Two lovable, curious Harfoots encounter a mysterious lost man whose origin promises to be one of the show's most enticing enigmas. So they have nothing to do with the story. They're just there to introduce another, probably original character. You didn't introduce the whole race of people just to bring someone else in. Madness. Total madness." And then the article has the temerity to say, quote, "Even hardcore fans who regard Tolkien's work as sacrosanct will recognize his message of unity. Staying true to that is as important as realizing his vision of places and characters from this little-known era in his fiction." Yeah, and you know what this hardcore fan says to that? "Ishkak fe, I durug nul." Tell me what's important and lost your damn mind. We'll see how the show turns out. I never had much hope that the show would turn out well, especially once I found out that the showrunners would be making up the story instead of following the books. It seems at least someone in the Tolkien estate was smart enough not to let these people get their hands on the first stage stories, although that may have been the late Christopher Tolkien, who was very protective of his father's work. I don't know if there's anyone else in the family as hardcore as he was. I imagine that the designs by Weta will look okay. Howard Shore's name has been mentioned, so he might be doing the music. That would be solid. But I have no hopes for the story or the scripts at all. So if the show doesn't completely suck, it'll be better than my expectations. What can I say other than Onin I Esteladan, Ukeben Estelanim? But what do I know? I'm just some guy.